The world is divided into 4 spheres, each sphere divided among continents and nations. Nations are divided by borders and interests. These interests divide the news. We examine the impact of these divisions on people and power. This is Imaginary Minds. Welcome to the program. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Coming up on the show, U.S. media have escalated their systematic and negative coverage of Venezuela. So much so, some say a second coup is underway. I'll speak with attorney and author of the Chavez Code, Eva Gollinger, about what's going on. But first, a look at media and Latin America. The world's richest person, Mexican billionaire Carlos Slim, is now the largest holder of publicly traded shares in the New York Times Company. Forbes magazine ranks Slim as richer than Microsoft founder Bill Gates. In 2009, Slim bailed the New York Times out of financial crisis by giving the newspaper a $250 million loan. In exchange, the deal stipulated that Slim would receive 10-year notes with warrants convertible into Class A shares. In January, Slim converted those warrants, acquiring 15.9 million shares, 16.8% of the public stock. The ruling Sulzberger family still own 90% of Class B stock, allowing them to control the company. While Slim's public shares may not allow him to elect members to the company board, it will be interesting to see how the billionaire's financial contributions may affect the paper's reporting on Latin America, especially on countries such as his home Mexico, which, despite acute gang violence, corruption, and forced disappearances, has received mild treatment from the world's most influential media. In contrast to Mexico, Venezuela has been in the eye of the media storm. So much so that some believe a second coup is underway in the country. Eva Gollinger is an attorney and author of the Chavez Code. She joins me to discuss media coverage of Venezuela. Maybe you can begin by explaining how media have been escalating their attacks on Venezuela.
Well, there's been an ongoing and systematic campaign against Venezuela now for years, particularly in U.S. media, but also around the world, including within Venezuela. We've seen the media campaigns that are not just critical of the Venezuelan government, but actually appear to intentionally distort and manipulate facts and information about what's happening in the country. This, for example, escalated during the time of the April 2002 coup against President Chavez. Then later after that, when there was an opposition economic strike, work stoppage in the oil industry, but also across the country. And that included the media were heavily involved in Venezuela, the private media. Were involved in that effort to destabilize the government, and internationally media were involved as well. And so we've seen that start to peak again in the case of President Nicolas Maduro. It started happening last year when there were active street protests against his government, where we saw how that was portrayed in media outlets around the world as being these innocent students and youth were protesting this tyrannical government that was repressing them with violence and killing them, when in fact that couldn't have been further from the truth. I mean, first of all, they weren't students. Second of all, they had a coordinated strategy to force the either resignation or overthrow of the government, and that they in fact were violent. They used different types of weapons, ranging from traditional ones like guns and grenades to Molotov cocktails and stones and street barricades. Ended up killing over 40 people. The majority of those deaths were caused by those violent protesters. So now again, we've seen that start to pick up with the economic crisis that's been happening in Venezuela, the way it's being portrayed around the world. For example, in papers like the New York Times, when they're constantly publishing articles where they're not showing or even covering or mentioning what measures the government is taking to try to address the financial difficulties in the country, or the fact, for example, that almost every day, state authorities in Venezuela are confiscating tons and tons of food and other consumer goods that have been either hoarded by private businesses or were trying to cross the border into Colombia to be sold as contraband. That's not getting coverage, but they are covering long lines of people waiting at stores to buy products.
You mentioned earlier the New York Times. Say more about the track record of the Times' reporting on the Bolivarian Revolution, former President Hugo Chavez, and current President Nicolas Maduro.
Yeah, I mean, initially, obviously, the New York Times is one of the most influential newspapers around the world. And in general, even though they can be somewhat critical often of some U.S. foreign policy, they're in line with U.S. interests. It's part of their job. And so in the case of Venezuela, in the beginning years of the Chavez administration, it wasn't too overly critical or in any way noticeable in terms of the coverage, but it did start to increase as the efforts to overthrow Chavez through a coup started to increase. And then the Times was publishing articles that were favorable to the opposition viewpoint, which was the U.S. government viewpoint, which was that Chavez had to go. When the coup takes place, that was the sort of moment of truth when Chavez, was briefly ousted from power. And in that period, that Sunday, he was ousted on really a Thursday to Friday. He was out on Saturday and he was back on Sunday. But the New York Times had already gone to print, at, I guess, late Saturday night with an editorial that came out on Sunday as Chavez was already coming back to power, applauding the coup and recognizing and lauding the coup government, this dictatorship that not only had overthrown Chavez violently and kidnapped him, an elected president who was very popular, they also, that coup government had also dissolved all of Venezuela's institutions, including the Supreme Court, the parliament, and the Attorney General's office, amongst others, and even, throughout the Constitution that had been ratified in a national popular referendum just 3 years before that.
The U.S. has slapped sanctions on Venezuelan officials and condemned what they describe as criminalization of political dissent. What do they mean by political dissent, and who is the opposition?
Well, it makes me smile because it's so ironic for a U.S. government official to say that at this time in the United States where, U.S. authorities are constantly cracking down on protesters that have protested judicial decisions, favoring white police officers that have actually killed, innocent black men, as well as lots of other things. I just recall Occupy Wall Street protests where people were basically just rallied up and thrown into prison. In the case of Venezuela, they don't actually crack down on a lot of protests that take place without any kind of permits, and that then are openly declared as being, taking place in order to call for the resignation of the president or to promote efforts to overthrow the government. But this is an opposition that unfortunately hasn't played by democratic rules since they formed. And they started, they had a bad start. They started with a coup against Chavez. And since then, even when they've participated in elections, if they end up losing, they say it's fraud. If they end up winning, it's okay, but it's not enough and the system is still corrupt, and they've also been receiving large amounts, multi-million-dollar funding from U.S. government agencies to engage in these activities. So it's not a neutral opposition force that's sort of born inside of Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Eva, for joining me on Imaginary Lines.
Thanks for having me on the show. It's a really important issue to cover, so thanks.
About 2/3 of investigative journalists believe that the U.S. government has probably spied on them. According to a new study by Pew Research Center, released February 5th, 64% of those interviewed believe that the U.S. government likely collected data about their phone calls, emails, or other online communications. 8 in 10 believe that being a journalist increases the likelihood that their data will be collected. Among the 454 participants in the study, 38% say that in the past year they have changed the way they communicate with sources. The study reveals that there are also other problems which rank high for the profession. For example, in overwhelming majority, 88%, identify decreasing resources in newsrooms as their top concern. That's it for today's Imaginary Lies. Thanks for watching the show. I'm your host, Chris Spanos. Please join me next week.